Okay, so now that we have a rough understanding of the pieces, now we're going to actually build a robot. So this isn't the greatest robot, but it's a quick build, and that's important to start actually doing stuff. So I'm going to call it maybe the Pretty Good Bot. I think that's a good name for it, or maybe Pretty Good Rover, because bot's rather generic. I've laid these out sort of step by step in a way that will help me remember what to do at each point, so that way it's just smoother along the way. So these are all the pieces that you're going to need for this build, so it's really not very many. We'll start out with the brain. Assume that you've just opened yours. We'll pop this in. If you don't have the lithium, then you can pop in AA's and put the back panel on. So that part's easy enough. And we're going to use this part here, and we're going to drop in 2 of these black connector pegs into the top 2 center pieces, which should line up very nicely with these. There we go. So that part's easy enough. This part gets a little bit more complicated. So over here, we're going to actually use the motors as part of sort of the chassis itself. So they're going to help define the frame of the robot. They're going to connect to these pieces here. So if we put that together like that, and we can do the same thing to the one over here, the other pair, which you might not have been able to see because of these motors, but it was there. And these are going to go into here. Now the tricky part is that's actually going to go like this, so it's a little tricky to get that part on there, but we'll take care of that in a moment. That's where they're going to end up. This frame is going to go in between these 2 motors here, and these longer pegs are going to go in here, and they can be a little tricky. So that helps lock them in place. Now if you want to dismantle this later, this can be a little hard to get them out. So we have this attached here, and this is going to go over here. So this keeps them together so that way they don't wobble. And these parts here are going to attach right in that first one on each side. So it might be easier to actually instead put them into these parts first. It kind of varies from person to person, so do whatever is working better for you. That way was definitely easier for me. Alright, so this part is now attached to the here, but we're not very stable on this end. So now we can use these pieces here to help stabilize from this area over here. So these little pegs are going to go into here. And this last one is going to go over here where this connects with it. So that bottom hole there. Like so. And then we can do the other side. Whether it's easier for you to put the pegs in first into the beam itself, or whether it's easier for you to put them into the frame and this part of the motor, that's kind of up to you. Whatever works best for you. Alright, so now that's pretty stable. Oh. We're almost done, actually. Now, there are some improvements that could be made to this to stabilize it more, but that's not really important at this point. We're just trying to get a base build so that way we can actually do something. So put the driven tires on, which connect to the motor here, and we'll use these axles So we can put that, just push that through until it gets to the other side. And we can put this bushing on there. It can be a little difficult to line up. There we go. And then on the other side, we'll put a half bushing and a full bushing. And the tire itself, it doesn't really matter which way goes on. And then, well, I should put the tire on the hub before attaching the whole thing. When you're putting the tire on, watch the edges. Sometimes it can get a little hung up and maybe not go on the whole way. So you want to make sure that it's really on there properly. So you shouldn't be able to see edges of the plastic rim on either side. It should look pretty uniform. Sometimes it'll accidentally come over, or it might not be all the way over. It might be caught on this part there on the inside. So just make sure that it's right, because that can cause some minor issues when you're driving with it. So looks okay to me on both sides. And then we can pop this on. Alright, and then we can put this half bushing on there. Now there is a bit of the axle sticking out still, and that's okay. We're going to use that later on in some of the very first things that we do. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Now you might be wondering why I put all those bushings on there, and I'll explain that in just a minute. The bushings help keep things in place to reduce the components or the pieces slowly creeping. So a little bit of extra friction helps keep this where it's supposed to go. And it's also important on this end too, because if we use it without the bushing, looks good, looks good. If we do it without the bushing, you can see this rub against that, which can wear down your tire faster and can also cause some drag issues when you're programming it to do stuff. And if you only use just one bushing, the reason we used a whole bushing and a half bushing is even with just one bushing, it looks, it might be okay. It looks okay. It looks like there's a little bit of clearance in between there, but when we set it down, it gets a little bit closer just due to the weights. If it's running over a bump or something, that might cause it to actually touch. So putting an extra half bushing in there, just to really make sure that everything stays the way it should be. There we go. So we've got our two main powered wheels in. Every now and then you'll get a couple people who will think that maybe it's a good idea to put a long axle that goes across both motors and have that axle powered by both motors at the same time for extra power. But the motors don't always spin at the same time, so that's not great. The other issue too is if you want to turn the robot, you typically power one wheel and not the other, so if you have one axle on both, you can't easily turn. So don't do that. Separate axles for each motor. The last part is we need, well, almost the last part. So we will need to connect these motors to the brain using some of the cables. So on the older ones, they had a little small wheel that you would use. It would spin around and rotate, so that way if it turned then it would go the other way, but the problem is sometimes it would get caught. This new model uses a steel ball and a ball bearing, and it works much better, so it's completely free spinning instead of the whole device trying to spin like it did on the old wheel. Alright, so we've got this part. This part is going to sit in between two of these. So this will be here and that will be there, and we can put that through. There we go. The reason we're using the axle here is because of course that's all that fits on this end of this 2x4 angle beam. There we go. And then we've got this piece too, which I should have actually put on there before the axle. There we go. Because of that little ridge, obviously you can't put it on after you have all three together. There we go, so that works pretty well. This is going to connect to here. It's going to sit right there. But to do that, we're going to use also these angled beams. So this will fit into there, and this will fit into there, which is why we use the 4-piece. So just using one of the 3 beams. And we'll pop this in there, maybe, if it wants to cooperate. There we go. And now we have our nice little robot. Now, there are a few issues still. This does move around a little bit, but it's pretty secure. There are a few things that you could do to stabilize and to strengthen the build, but it was quick, and it's pretty much done. All we need is the data wires. So these are the 2 mid-length ones. There are the shorter ones, but they probably won't work very well trying to go from here all the way to the other side. You might say, well, what about this part? These are for the sensors. 1, 2, 3, 4 is for the sensors. A, B, C, D is for the motors. So we're connecting this part over here. You might say, well, why don't you flip the brain around? And you could do that if you want to. Judgment call. I like using these ones with this build because it also shows kind of how you can use this area underneath. We can use this to help manage our wires, so that way we don't have them all over the place with the robot possibly driving over them or them getting stuck on stuff. So we can feed the wires through here. So typically for the motors, you typically plug them in B and C, and A is typically reserved for an arm, but not always. It doesn't matter which side of the connectors you plug into the motors, it's all the same. Now we can feed this one through. We'll plug that one into C. And plug it in right there. You could use A and B, you could use B and C, you could even use C and D. It doesn't really matter as long as you pay attention to what you're doing and which motor ports you're using when you're actually programming, making sure that they match up with what you've plugged in. So there we go. There's a basic bot.